In 1898, America bought an entire nation for $20 million. 7 million people. Sold. Without being asked once. No war crime tribunal ever punished anyone for it. This isn't ancient history, it's barely 4 generations back. A mysterious explosion killed 260 sailors in Havana Harbor. 2 newspaper tycoons turned that explosion into a war. That war gave America an empire it never admitted having. By the end, this deal ignited a war of its own. That second war killed more people than the first one. Historians still argue whether it was liberation or theft. The nation being sold already had its own government. It had a constitution, a Congress. A working republic. The first democratic republic in the entire continent of Asia. None of that stopped 2 empires from cutting a deal. They met in Paris. The Filipinos weren't invited. In one afternoon, an entire people changed owners on paper. The man who led them refused to accept it. He fought a guerrilla war against the U.S. Army for years. American soldiers called it a civilizing mission. Historians today call parts of it a war crime. Concentration camps were built. Torture was standard procedure. One method was called the water cure. It killed people. A senator read the death toll aloud in Congress. The room went silent. Nobody denied the number. This story has bribery, propaganda, prayer, and mass graves. It has a president who claimed God told him what to do. It has a general who burned villages to save them. By the next few minutes, you'll understand modern American power. Because this deal built the blueprint for every intervention after. Here's the full, uncut history of how it happened. Cuba was already burning before America got involved at all. Cuban rebels had fought Spanish colonial rule since 1895. Spain responded by herding civilians into reconcentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of Cuban civilians died from starvation and disease. American newspapers barely covered it, until it became profitable. Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst ran competing newspaper empires. Both men were locked in a brutal circulation war. Sensational Cuban atrocity stories sold more papers than anything else. Some stories were true. Many were wildly exaggerated for sales. This tactic later earned the name yellow journalism. Hearst reportedly told an illustrator, "Furnish the pictures. He'd furnish war." Historians debate if that quote is real, but the mindset was. Then, on February 15, 1898, the USS Maine exploded in Havana. 260 American sailors died in the blast. The cause was never conclusively proven at the time. A Navy inquiry blamed an external mine with no hard proof. A later 1976 investigation suggested an internal coal bunker fire instead. It didn't matter. The headlines had already decided the truth. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, became a national chant. Congress declared war on Spain less than 3 months later. President McKinley initially resisted war, preferring diplomacy with Spain. Public and political pressure eventually overwhelmed his hesitation completely. The Teller Amendment promised Cuba would not become a U.S. colony. No such promise was ever made about anywhere else. That single omission would matter enormously within the year. Few Americans in April 1898 had ever heard of the Philippines. Most couldn't have located the islands on a map. Within 4 months, that ignorance would shape millions of lives. The war Congress declared was framed purely as Cuban liberation. It quietly became something far larger, far faster. The U.S. Navy's Asiatic Squadron was already stationed nearby, ready. Its commander had secret orders before war was even declared. Commodore George Dewey was told to attack Spanish forces in Manila. This wasn't defense. This was a planned offensive strike. The target had nothing to do with freeing Cuba. It exposed the war's real ambitions from the very start. American expansionists, like Theodore Roosevelt, had pushed for this outcome. Roosevelt, then Assistant Navy Secretary, had positioned the fleet himself. He acted while his superior was briefly out of the office. Some historians call it insubordination that changed world history. The Spanish-American War is remembered as short and splendid. Secretary of State John Hay literally called it a splendid little war. For Spain, it was a catastrophic collapse of a global empire. For the Philippines, it was the start of a new nightmare. For America, it was the birth of overseas imperial ambition. The explosion in Havana Harbor never fully answered its own mystery. But its consequences reached 6,000 miles across the Pacific. A colony no one at home understood was about to be seized. The next battle wouldn't happen in Cuba at all. May 1, 1898, Commodore Dewey's fleet entered Manila Bay before dawn. The Spanish Pacific Fleet was outdated, outgunned, and badly positioned. Dewey reportedly told his flag captain, "You may fire when ready." Within hours, the entire Spanish squadron was destroyed or disabled. Spanish casualties numbered in the hundreds. American losses were nearly zero. It remains one of history's most lopsided naval battles ever recorded. News of the victory stunned newspapers back in the United States. Overnight, Dewey became a national hero most Americans had never expected. But Dewey had ships, not soldiers to hold territory. He needed ground forces to actually capture Manila itself. Meanwhile, a Filipino revolutionary had been waiting for this moment. Emilio Aguinaldo had led an uprising against Spain since 1896. He had previously accepted exile money from Spain to pause fighting. Dewey brought Aguinaldo back to the Philippines aboard a U.S. ship. Both sides later disputed exactly what promises were made then. Aguinaldo believed America supported full Philippine independence from Spain. American officials later insisted no such formal guarantee was given. This ambiguity would explode into open war within the year. Filipino rebel forces rapidly retook territory across Luzon from Spain. By June 1898, Filipino forces had Manila almost completely surrounded. Aguinaldo's army controlled most of the archipelago outside the capital. Spain's centuries-long grip on the Philippines was effectively already broken. American troops finally began arriving in the Philippines that summer. Their stated mission still officially targeted only Spanish forces. Filipino revolutionaries treated the Americans as welcome temporary allies. They had no idea they were sheltering their next enemy. On June 12, 1898, Aguinaldo declared Philippine independence from Spain. Filipino leaders raised their flag for the first time publicly. The declaration named Aguinaldo as the new nation's dictator, then president. A national anthem was composed and performed at the ceremony. The United States did not recognize this declaration at all. No American official attended or acknowledged the new government. This silence was a warning sign almost nobody understood yet. August 13, 1898. American and Spanish forces staged a mock battle. Spain preferred, surrendering to the U.S. rather than to Filipino rebels. American and Spanish commanders secretly arranged Manila's fall in advance. Filipino troops were deliberately excluded from entering the captured city. This was the first direct betrayal Filipino revolutionaries experienced firsthand. It would not be the last, and it would get worse. Aguinaldo's government now controlled nearly the entire Philippine archipelago. They had a working Congress, courts, and a functioning bureaucracy. The Malolos Republic was drafted, one of Asia's first written constitutions. It guaranteed free speech, religious freedom, and separation of powers. On paper, the Philippines had built a modern democratic state. In Washington, none of this factored into the coming decision. Spain and America were about to negotiate the island's fate. The people who actually lived there were never at that table. Dewey's naval victory had cracked the door open for empire. What walked through that door next shocked even some Americans. President McKinley faced an unprecedented question few Americans had considered. Should the United States annex a densely populated Asian archipelago? No U.S. precedent existed for ruling millions of non-citizens overseas. McKinley later described agonizing over the decision for weeks. He famously told a group of visiting ministers his reasoning. He said he prayed and walked the White House floor nightly. McKinley claimed a moment of clarity told him to take it all. Historians question whether this pious account was later political spin. Economic and strategic motives were far less romantic than prayer. The Philippines offered a naval foothold near lucrative Asian markets. American businesses eyed China's massive market just across the sea. Coaling stations for the Navy were becoming a global necessity. European and Japanese imperial rivals were expanding aggressively nearby. Letting the islands go seemed to some a strategic gift to rivals. McKinley considered several options before settling on full annexation. Returning the islands to Spain was rejected as morally indefensible. Granting immediate independence was dismissed as premature and unstable. Handing them to another European power was seen as unacceptable. Full U.S. annexation was framed as the only responsible choice. Racist assumptions underpinned much of this reasoning at the time. Many U.S. officials doubted Filipinos were capable of self-government. This paternalistic language echoed European colonial justifications directly. McKinley called it America's duty to uplift and civilize Filipinos. Most Filipinos were already Catholic, contradicting claims about Christianizing them. The justification ignored the advanced republic Filipinos had already built. On December 21, 1898, McKinley issued the Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation. It declared U.S. sovereignty over the entire Philippine archipelago. Filipino leaders read it as a direct declaration of ownership. Aguinaldo's government saw it as betrayal wrapped in polite language. Filipino newspapers republished the proclamation with furious editorial responses. Tensions between American and Filipino soldiers escalated sharply after this. Both armies now occupied the same city, watching each other closely. Neither side had officially declared war on the other yet. Soldiers on both sides grew increasingly anxious and heavily armed. Small incidents of friction multiplied throughout January 1899. Filipino leaders proposed diplomatic talks to avoid open conflict. American commanders largely dismissed these overtures as beneath consideration. Washington had already made its decision months before fighting began. The Senate still needed to ratify the treaty being negotiated. Anti-imperialist senators fiercely opposed annexing the Philippines outright. Mark Twain became one of America's most vocal imperialism critics. The Anti-Imperialist League gained prominent public figures as members. Andrew Carnegie reportedly offered to personally buy Philippine independence. None of this opposition changed the administration's fundamental course. McKinley's decision effectively erased a nation's declared independence overnight. A proclamation written in Washington reshaped millions of lives abroad. The treaty formalizing this decision was already being drafted in Paris. What happened at that negotiating table sealed the Philippines' fate. October 1898, American and Spanish delegates convened in Paris, France. Their task was formally ending the brief Spanish-American War. No Filipino representative was invited to attend these negotiations. Aguinaldo sent representatives to Washington, but they were ignored. Spain still legally claimed sovereignty over the Philippine Islands. This was despite controlling almost no actual Philippine territory anymore. American negotiators initially debated keeping only a Philippine naval base. Manila alone seemed sufficient to some early U.S. strategists. Expansionist pressure back home pushed negotiators toward the entire archipelago. Spain resisted surrendering the Philippines without significant financial compensation. American negotiators eventually agreed to pay Spain $20 million. This wasn't reparations, it was framed as compensation for infrastructure. $20 million in 1898 equals roughly $700 million today. Spain accepted the money rather than continue a war it couldn't win. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was formally signed. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the U.S. Cuba was granted nominal independence, though heavily controlled by America. The treaty transferred sovereignty over 7 million Filipinos in writing. Not one Filipino signature appeared anywhere on that document. Aguinaldo's government was never consulted, informed, or represented at all. Filipinos learned of the treaty through second-hand press reports. The transaction resembled a real estate deal more than diplomacy. Historians frequently describe it as one nation literally purchasing another. The treaty still required ratification by the U.S. Senate to take effect. Debate in the Senate grew fierce and deeply divided. Anti-imperialists argued annexation violated core American founding principles. Expansionists argued America needed colonies to compete as a world power. The vote was scheduled for early February 1899, painfully close. Then, almost impossibly convenient timing, fighting broke out in Manila. On February 4, 1899, an American sentry shot a Filipino soldier. Some historians argue the timing critically influenced the Senate vote. Fighting erupting mid-debate framed rejection as abandoning troops in danger. The Senate ratified the Treaty of Paris on February 6, 1899. The margin was razor-thin, just one vote beyond the required two-thirds. The Philippines officially became a U.S. colonial possession that day. Filipino independence, declared just months earlier, was now legally erased. A functioning republic had been overwritten by a foreign treaty. Aguinaldo's government continued operating as if still legitimate anyway. They refused to accept a paper transaction as their nation's fate. Fighting that began February 4th quickly escalated into full war. This became known as the Philippine-American War, not merely an insurrection. U.S. officials deliberately used the word insurrection to downplay it. Calling it an insurrection implied Filipinos had no legitimate nation. Framing mattered. It shaped how Congress and citizens perceived events. The war that followed lasted far longer than the Spanish-American War. It cost far more lives on both sides than anyone predicted. What started as a splendid little war became something else entirely. A brutal colonial war most Americans today have never learned about. The Philippine-American War officially lasted from 1899 to 1902. Some historians extend the conflict's true end date to 1913. Over 126,000 American troops eventually served in the Philippines. Roughly 4,200 American soldiers died during the entire conflict. Filipino combatant deaths are estimated between 20,000 and 34,000 killed. Filipino civilian deaths are estimated between 200,000 and 1 million. Most civilian deaths came from disease, starvation, and displacement, not combat. Early conventional battles favored America's superior weapons and training. Filipino forces quickly shifted toward guerrilla warfare tactics instead. This forced American troops into brutal, unfamiliar counterinsurgency operations. U.S. General Jacob Smith gave an infamous order in Samar Province. He reportedly ordered troops to make the island a howling wilderness. He allegedly told soldiers to kill anyone over the age of 10. Smith was later court-martialed, but received only a light reprimand. On the island of Batangas, General J. Franklin Bell built concentration camps. Civilians were forcibly relocated into these guarded reconcentration zones. Zones outside the camps were declared free-fire areas for troops. Disease and malnutrition killed thousands of civilians inside these camps. The water cure became a widely used interrogation torture method. Water was forced into a prisoner's stomach until it caused agony. Sometimes soldiers then stomped on the victim's swollen abdomen. This torture method was documented in U.S. Senate hearings later. Soldiers' letters home casually described violence that shocked American readers. Some letters were published in newspapers, sparking public outrage domestically. Senator George Frisbee Hoar delivered fierce anti-war speeches in Congress. A Senate committee investigated reported atrocities starting in 1902. Testimony revealed executions, torture, and destroyed villages under military command. Mark Twain wrote scathing satire condemning American conduct in the war. His essay, To the Person Sitting in Darkness, mocked imperial hypocrisy. The Balangiga massacre saw Filipino fighters kill dozens of U.S. soldiers. American reprisals for Balangiga were especially brutal and widely condemned. Aguinaldo was captured by American forces on March 23, 1901. His capture involved a deceptive raid using disguised Filipino scouts. Aguinaldo eventually swore allegiance to the United States after capture. Organized resistance weakened significantly following his capture and pledge. Sporadic fighting and resistance movements continued for years afterward. The Moro people in the southern Philippines resisted separately and longer. The Moro Rebellion continued fighting well into the 1910s. President Theodore Roosevelt declared the main war officially over in 1902. He did so despite continuing violence in several island regions. American press coverage of the war's brutality faded relatively quickly. Textbooks in following decades largely minimized or omitted these events. Generations of Americans grew up never learning this history existed. Meanwhile, the Philippines had lost hundreds of thousands of people, all to enforce a treaty its people never agreed to sign. The war proved brutally that benevolent assimilation was mostly propaganda. Filipino resistance had been fierce, organized, and remarkably sustained. It simply couldn't match American industrial and military firepower long-term. This wasn't liberation. Documented evidence shows this was conquest. After 1902, the U.S. formally administered the Philippines as a colony. William Howard Taft became the first American civilian governor there. Taft later became U.S. President, then Supreme Court Chief Justice. American colonial rule introduced public schools across the archipelago. English became the primary language taught in Philippine classrooms. Infrastructure projects built roads, ports, and public health systems. Colonial administrators framed these projects as proof of good intentions. Critics noted infrastructure often served American economic interests first. Filipino political participation was severely restricted for many years. A Filipino legislature was allowed, but with limited real power. American governors retained veto power over most major decisions. Filipino elites who cooperated with American rule gained local influence. Those who resisted were often imprisoned, exiled, or worse. Sugar and agricultural exports increasingly flowed toward American markets. The colonial economy was restructured to primarily benefit the United States. Filipino nationalists never stopped pushing for genuine independence during this era. The Jones Act of 1916 promised eventual independence, without a firm date. This vague promise pacified some nationalist sentiment temporarily. The Great Depression shifted American economic calculations about the colony. American farmers began viewing Philippine agricultural imports as competition. Suddenly, independence became economically convenient rather than morally urgent. The Tydings-McDuffie Act of 1934 finally set a 10-year independence timeline. The Philippine Commonwealth was established as a transitional government in 1935. Manuel Quezon became the Commonwealth's first Filipino president. World War II brutally interrupted this planned path to independence. Japan invaded and occupied the Philippines starting in December 1941. Filipino and American troops fought side by side against Japan. The Bataan Death March became one of the war's darkest atrocities. Filipino guerrilla resistance against Japanese occupation was fierce and widespread. General Douglas MacArthur famously vowed, "I shall return," and eventually did. Manila was devastated during its brutal 1945 liberation battle. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the fighting for Manila. On July 4, 1946, the Philippines finally gained full independence. 48 years after Aguinaldo's original 1898 declaration was ignored. Nearly half a century of colonial rule had permanently reshaped the nation. English remains widely spoken in the Philippines to this day. American military bases remained in the Philippines for decades afterward. Economic ties between both nations stayed deeply intertwined long-term. The Philippines' political system still reflects American institutional influence heavily. Filipino identity today carries visible imprints of this colonial history. The 1898 treaty's consequences didn't end with formal independence at all. Cultural, economic, and political legacies persisted for generations afterward. Understanding modern use of Philippine relations requires understanding this origin story. Nothing about it began with mutual consent between equal nations. It began with a $20 million transaction nobody there approved. After 1902, the U.S. formally administered the Philippines as a colony. William Howard Taft became the first American civilian governor there. Taft later became U.S. President, then Supreme Court Chief Justice. American colonial rule introduced public schools across the archipelago. English became the primary language taught in Philippine classrooms. Infrastructure projects built roads, ports, and public health systems. Colonial administrators framed these projects as proof of good intentions. Critics noted infrastructure often served American economic interests first. Filipino political participation was severely restricted for many years. A Filipino legislature was allowed, but with limited real power. American governors retained veto power over most major decisions. Filipino elites who cooperated with American rule gained local influence. Those who resisted were often imprisoned, exiled, or worse. Sugar and agricultural exports increasingly flowed toward American markets. The colonial economy was restructured to primarily benefit the United States. Filipino nationalists never stopped pushing for genuine independence during this era. The Jones Act of 1916 promised eventual independence, without a firm date. This vague promise pacified some nationalist sentiment temporarily. The Great Depression shifted American economic calculations about the colony. American farmers began viewing Philippine agricultural imports as competition. Suddenly, independence became economically convenient rather than morally urgent. The Tydings-McDuffie Act of 1934 finally set a 10-year independence timeline. The Philippine Commonwealth was established as a transitional government in 1935. Manuel Quezon became the Commonwealth's first Filipino president. World War II brutally interrupted this planned path to independence. Japan invaded and occupied the Philippines starting in December 1941. Filipino and American troops fought side by side against Japan. The Bataan Death March became one of the war's darkest atrocities. Filipino guerrilla resistance against Japanese occupation was fierce and widespread. General Douglas MacArthur famously vowed, "I shall return," and eventually did. Manila was devastated during its brutal 1945 liberation battle. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the fighting for Manila. On July 4, 1946, the Philippines finally gained full independence. 48 years after Aguinaldo's original 1898 declaration was ignored. Nearly half a century of colonial rule had permanently reshaped the nation. English remains widely spoken in the Philippines to this day. American military bases remained in the Philippines for decades afterward. Economic ties between both nations stayed deeply intertwined long-term. The Philippines' political system still reflects American institutional influence heavily. Filipino identity today carries visible imprints of this colonial history. The 1898 treaty's consequences didn't end with formal independence at all. Cultural, economic, and political legacies persisted for generations afterward. Understanding modern U.S.-Philippine relations requires understanding this origin story. Nothing about it began with mutual consent between equal nations. It began with a $20 million transaction nobody there approved. The Philippines was America's first major overseas colonial territory. It established a precedent for future American interventions abroad. The playbook used here echoed later in Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua. Propaganda, intervention, occupation, and civilizing language repeated for decades. Historians call this pattern the foundation of American interventionism. The anti-imperialist league's warnings proved prophetic in hindsight. They warned empire abroad would corrode democracy at home eventually. The Philippine-American War remains one of history's most undertaught conflicts. Most American history classes spend mere minutes on this entire war. Yet its death toll rivals or exceeds many wars taught extensively. Filipino historians and scholars remember this period very differently. In the Philippines, this era is taught as national trauma. Statues and monuments to Aguinaldo stand throughout the country today. June 12th, the original independence date, is still celebrated nationally. The Malolos Republic's constitution remains a source of national pride. It's remembered as proof Filipinos built democracy before America gave it. Modern historians increasingly reframe this as America's first counterinsurgency war. Techniques developed there influenced later American military doctrine directly. Some scholars trace direct lines from Manila to later conflicts. The water cure resurfaced in later interrogation controversies, decades later. The concentration camp strategy foreshadowed tactics in later 20th century wars. This history complicates the simple narrative of American benevolence abroad. It reveals empire building dressed carefully in humanitarian language. The $20 million payment framed conquest as a legitimate business transaction. Legally, it worked. Morally, historians remain deeply divided today. Was this liberation from Spain or simply a change of masters? Filipino revolutionaries who fought Spain ended up fighting America instead. Their republic existed for less than a year before being crushed. No peace treaty has ever formally acknowledged this original injustice. The United States has never issued an official apology for it. A 1999 Senate resolution expressed regret, falling short of apology. Filipino-American communities today still carry this history's cultural weight. Understanding 1898 helps explain deep patterns in U.S. foreign policy since. Intervention justified by values, followed by economic and strategic interests. This pattern repeated across the 20th century in various forms. The Philippines shows how quickly moral language can mask conquest. It shows how a free press can manufacture consent for war. It shows how quickly a declared republic can be erased on paper. These aren't just historical footnotes, they're recurring political mechanisms. Recognizing them in 1898 helps recognize them in later decades too. History rarely repeats exactly, but its patterns rhyme uncomfortably often. The Treaty of Paris remains a case study in imperial ambition. It's a reminder that nations, like people, remember being erased. Filipinos never forgot the republic that existed before the treaty. That memory outlasted the empire that tried to overwrite it. So is this liberation from Spain, or simply a new occupation? The evidence suggests something far more complicated than either label. America freed the Philippines from one empire and became another. A functioning Asian republic was erased by a European-style treaty. $20 million bought sovereignty over 7 million human beings. That transaction still shapes power dynamics in the Pacific today. The war that followed killed more people than most Americans realize. Concentration camps and torture weren't isolated incidents, they were policy. Yet this history rarely appears in standard American classrooms today. Forgetting it doesn't erase its consequences. It just hides them. The Philippines eventually won its independence, but only after decades. Aguinaldo lived long enough to see his republic finally recognized. He died in 1964, 66 years after his first declaration. His original 1898 government remains a source of national pride today. The Malolos Republic proved Filipinos never needed America's permission to self-govern. This story isn't just about the past century's forgotten war. It's about how empires justify themselves using the language of virtue. It's about how easily a free press can manufacture public consent. It's about how quickly declared nations can be erased on paper. These patterns didn't end in 1898, they evolved and repeated. Understanding this history changes how you read modern foreign policy. It changes how you interpret words like intervention and assistance. The next time you hear a nation described as not ready, remember this. Remember a republic that was ready and was erased anyway.